Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. So this is your lesson on parents and grandparents who immigrate to Canada as permanent residents through the family class. You're going to see that this, of course, plays a role in your full skills exam, in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, because it has to do with family. Now, family is one of the best topics you can study in preparing for your full skills exam, because it's pretty manageable and a lot of the themes actually transcend into other ways in which people immigrate through the family class. So you might think of this as similar to Express Entry, for example, where Express Entry plays a role, of course, in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, Canadian Experience class, and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. In family class, there are a lot of underlying themes that connect all of these different ways in which people immigrate as permanent residents through the spouse programs, of course, as children of permanent residents or citizens, other family members, and of course, parents and grandparents. So you might think this is a pretty easy topic. It's not, actually. There are a lot of little hidden tricks in here. And what we're going to do is go through this really thoroughly as your first lesson in family class, because you'll see it's not as easy as you think. And all of these little tricky areas actually pertain to spousal sponsorship, common law sponsorship, dependent child sponsorship, and other family members' sponsorship as well. All right, so I really hope you enjoy the lesson, and we'll get started right now. Now, if you have a general sense of family sponsorship, and by the time you're watching this video, it's usually for people who finished their immigration consultant diploma at one of the schools that offer this program. So usually you have a really great base knowledge of this. What we're going to do is just kind of go over some of those details again, and of course transfer this knowledge into an exam setting. Now, if you have that general knowledge of family sponsorship, you're about halfway there already. What we're going to do is just fine-tune some of your knowledge about parents and grandparents. Now, this program is really interesting as well because it's been around for quite a while. So there are a lot of really interesting resources that you can use to study for this program. You should be watching this on the website. I've got the link for you on the bottom here. So it's at the website, at our website, www.fullskillsexamprep.com. Go to the free lessons section of the website, and the lesson would be right there. All these links are just waiting for you. So in order to fully understand this topic, you're going to have to work through these links. Though sometimes it takes a little while to navigate through the IRCC website. So we've got everything ready for you, and you can just click your way through these. Now, the best one, personally, I find, is Guide 5772. I think this takes all of the really concise information you'll find throughout the rest of the links and makes it manageable, makes it concise, makes it direct. So if you only have time to look through one website or one of those links on the website, make it this one here because it's really concise, very practical as well. Okay, you've got a couple other sections of the IRCC website. So sponsor your parents and grandparents, and of course the applications themselves. Now these are both really good links to look at. You have the manuals as well. So you have OP2 and IP2. Now these manuals, as you know with all the manuals really that still exist, they haven't been updated in a long time, but it's good just to give you kind of a base knowledge of family class and immigration through family class. But just a little word of warning, there's going to be some areas of that aren't exactly updated. All right, and finally, if you're looking through your IRPA, you've got Regulation 4, 117, 130, and 133 as good starting points. So you'll work your way, of course, past those articles to get a fuller picture of what we're talking about today. Now you probably noticed that this topic has been in the news quite a bit recently with the new government, of course. Well, they're not that new now anymore, I guess, but that was one of their platforms, was to increase parent and grandparent permanent residency. When you start working as an RCIC, I guarantee you're going to have a lot of clients who want to sponsor their parents. I don't know if there are that many grandparents, but parents for sure. And that's actually one of the big selling points of Canada. You're going to see once you start working as an immigration consultant that a lot of your potential clients are choosing between maybe Canada, Australia, England, USA. And one of the big selling points for Canada, of course, is that they can sponsor their parents. So this has been in the news quite a bit. One of the big things that the Liberal government wants to do is really concentrate on family reunification. So this is definitely going to play a role once you start your business. If you're preparing for your full skills exam, that's going to be probably in a couple months even. So it's something small to think about right away. These news articles are linked for you below the video as well. So if you want to take a look through these, they're pretty manageable, and it just gives you kind of a broader perspective on this topic, though it's not necessarily that great for your exam. All right, so let's jump into this as it relates to your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So remember, what we do, of course, at Full Skills Exam Prep is take all of that really great immigration knowledge that you've acquired in your program, and we help you to transfer that into an exam setting. Now, parents and grandparents who apply for permanent residency through the family class, this is a really great piece of the puzzle that you're going to have to master in order to be able to pass your full skills exam. The good news with this, of course, is that it's concise, straightforward. There's a few little tricky areas that we're going to look at, but once you are able to manage those tricky areas, you'll be able to really be able to answer questions quickly and accurately. You've got 3 sample questions after this, same as usual. And again, after this lesson, some of those little tricky areas of those questions will hopefully jump out at you, and you'll be able to answer it really quickly and be very confident in your answers as well. Okay, so we're going to go through this really step by step. Now you have 2 general requirements for the person who is sponsoring his or her parents or grandparents. One of those you can see in Regulation 117. Okay, so you could see that very basically, just as a first step, the sponsor has to be sponsoring his mother or father, or the mother or father of the sponsor's mother or father, so the grandparents. All right, that's one of the easiest things to understand in this topic. And of course, the sponsor himself or herself must be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident who is a minimum of 18 years old, resides in Canada, and pretty obviously has filled out the sponsorship application. All right, there's 3 other really big pieces of this puzzle to understand. We're going to talk about those in about 7 minutes probably. All right, so taking those first 2 pieces of the puzzle. So a sponsor must be 18 or older, must be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and must be in Canada. Remember that the person being sponsored must be the parent or grandparent of this person. So I'll give you just a tiny little activity to begin with here, and what I want you to do is draw an arrow just to indicate who can sponsor who as a parent or grandparent. All right, so I'll give you a minute for this. And of course, you don't have to draw on your computer screen. You could just think of the arrow. Okay, so let's jump in here and we'll see how you did. Okay, so one of those first arrows, of course, is the gentleman here with the tie and the yellow background. So you can see that he's the kid of the man with the red beard and the woman with the black background with the short black hair. So they are Mexican. That's a Mexican flag over there. And now this person is over 18. He's Canadian. So we could just tell by the Canadian flag there. And so yes, he could sponsor his mother. The woman with the red hair and the green background could sponsor her father, of course. Just as the gentleman can. And of course, their brother and sister, they could both sponsor their parents, not a problem at all. All right, and they can also sponsor the grandparents. Okay, so these are the only people who can be sponsored, and the only people who can sponsor, of course. When you're looking at the left side of the screen here, so on the bottom, you have two Canadians on the left side who are brother and sister, but they're under 18, so they can't sponsor anybody. All right, you can see the parents are Mexican, so they obviously can't sponsor anyone to be Canadian. When you look on the right side, you can see the kid, so that's a 3-year-old kid. She can't sponsor anybody because she's only 3. And of course the dog can't sponsor anybody either. So basically only the brother and sister in this case can sponsor the parents. However, there's an important point we're going to look at in a minute. And you're going to see this throughout the whole lesson. You're going to see it throughout 2 of the sample questions you're going to look at later. And that is with regard to the spouse of the gentleman with the yellow background who can potentially sponsor his parents and grandparents. Okay, so let's take a look at this through a bit of a different angle. And this might seem basic, but of course we just want to go through this really step by step. Now, when we take a look at the people in number 2 and 3, so the couple, let's pretend that they sponsored his parents. So the people at 5 and 6. And now those people are Canadian. Remember, of course, that his sister, so 4, number 4, can sponsor her grandparents. He can sponsor his grandparents as well, of course. But now you have the added benefit because his mother can sponsor her parents to become Canadian as well. Now I know exactly what you're asking. You're probably asking about the spouses. So number 2 and number 5, and what role they play in helping their spouse, so number 3 and 6, to sponsor those grandparents. That's the next thing that we'll talk about right now. Okay, so in understanding the role of spouses or common law partners in helping their partner sponsor their parents or grandparents, it's really important to understand this role. You're going to see this, of course, in a couple of the exam simulations we're going to look at later, touch on this topic. And in reality, they can be co-signers to the person applying to sponsor, the parents or grandparents. Now this is in Regulation 132, and basically they would do it together. So you can see that the person at number 4, she can sponsor her grandparents, of course, no problem at all. Now the gentleman at number 3 can sponsor his grandparents together with his wife as a co-signer. And the exact same thing with the couple at 5 and 6. So the spouse who isn't a blood relative of the person they want to sponsor would still be able to co-sign for that person to be eligible to immigrate under the family class. There are a lot of little tricky details in here though. Okay, so the co-signer really has to meet the same requirements as the sponsor. Now we saw just a couple of these. So we saw that the person has to be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, 18 or over, residing in Canada. Together they can pool their funds in order to meet the LICO. We'll take a look at the LICO again later. If you went through the Super Visa lesson, you probably have a good idea about it. But the beauty of this, though, is that they can combine their incomes to meet that. All right, they have to co-sign the undertaking, and that means they're both responsible for that undertaking. We're going to see more and more that this is a huge responsibility, and you're going to see this in one of the scenarios we're going to look at later. Now, if those obligations that they agree to undertake are not met, they're both equally responsible. And we're going to see that this is a huge obligation. It doesn't matter if they get divorced or anything like that. They're still both responsible. All right, so we'll take a look at that again throughout the lesson. But just as a first couple steps here, now you can see the relationship that spouses or common law partners have in helping sponsor a person's parents or grandparents. Okay, just to touch upon procedures for a couple minutes here. Now, if you have a person who is going to immigrate through the family class as a parent or grandparent, remember that these people, the parents and grandparents, they're not applying for permanent residency directly. They're not saying, okay, I have a son in Canada, or I have a daughter or a grandson or something like that in Canada. They don't apply directly. What happens is that the sponsor is doing two things at the same time in terms of procedures. So he's applying to be the sponsor and to be accepted as the sponsor at the same time as the PR application. Now you have the link just below this video with the applications themselves. It's a good idea to just kind of take a look at those really for just 5 minutes, just to give you a better idea about the procedures surrounding this stream. And just another tiny procedural note. Okay, this one here is based on first come, first serve. Now, if you've been working through the economic streams, this might seem a little bit backwards, but it's because they're not really choosing the best candidates or anything like that. It doesn't really exist for family, right? Now, first come, first serve is when they receive the application. That would be the first person processed, but only if the application is complete. Now, 2017 is going to have a cap of 10,000 complete applications. That's going to open January 3rd. The one that just passed not a few months ago, more than a few months ago now, was about the same. And they received, I believe it was 14,000 applications. Now that doesn't mean that everyone's accepted or everyone has a perfect application. That's your job as an RCIC, of course, is to make sure that those applications are perfect so that they are accepted. Because you can see that they received 14,000 applications this year. So if there's a mistake, it's not likely to be accepted, and the person would have to wait until next year. Okay, and of course those applications do not count towards the cap. So if they receive 14,000 applications like they did this year, and 5,000 of those are erroneous or not accepted, then there would still be 1,000 spots left for this. All right, and this, of course, is not very likely to be on your exam. There's nothing topical on the exam, of course, but just for your general knowledge, and just because this is going to play a role in your career as an immigration consultant in the future. Now, another important note, just because people ask about this sometimes, and some people who take the seminars and things like that, they seem to just have a little bit of confusion regarding the super visa and parents and grandparents who can obtain permanent residency. Remember, these are two very different programs. With the super visa, we've got a big lesson on the super visa in case you haven't seen it, but they need Canadian medical insurance. But of course, a person who is immigrating to Canada as a permanent resident doesn't need private medical insurance, right? Because they would be Canadian, so it's part of being Canadian. The super visa is essentially a tourist visa. It's just that they can stay for a long time. So they can stay in Canada for 2 years at a time as a visitor instead of the usual 6 months. Okay, there's of course the admissibility and support requirement for a super visa. This is very, very similar to parents and grandparents who can obtain PR. The big difference, though, is of course the super visa gives a person temporary resident status. Meanwhile, a person who immigrates as a parent and grandparent obtains permanent resident status. If you feel like you need to touch up on the super visa program, we've got a lesson for you covering this exact topic. So just work your way through the website, but of course, don't stop the video now and do this. Do it later on. Okay, so you have some general requirements for parents and grandparents. Now, this is sort of the easy part of this topic. Now, just like any other permanent resident applicant, they have to complete a medical check. If they're medically inadmissible, they are inadmissible, of course. Same thing with a criminal check. They have to be admissible in general, so that's all of those articles 34 through 42. So they can't be a war criminal and that kind of thing. A big one is, of course, to intend to live in Canada. So this isn't a tourist visa. It's not for people who want to come to Canada for 1 month a year. That's what the super visa is for. The big one as well is that they have to not use, or intend to not use, government financial assistance once they're in Canada. This is, of course, to prevent people from, I guess, going to Canada as maybe a retired person and going on welfare. So we're going to see how the government, how the IRCC gets people to basically not do this. And that relies on the requirements of the person sponsoring, the parents or grandparents. All right, so there are quite a few sponsor responsibilities. We took a look at this first one already. So the person has to be 18 or over, a citizen, a Canadian citizen, or permanent resident, and living in Canada. They have to, of course, be sponsoring their parent or grandparent. The only slight exception with that is, as we saw, with a co-sponsor. All right, a person can have a co-signer in there. That co-signer would need to be a spouse or common law partner. They have to sign an undertaking. Now, this is basically a contract between the person and the government. What they are saying is that they'll provide everything that the person being sponsored needs in order to live in Canada and live comfortably, I suppose. They do not only have to sign an agreement with the government, but they have to sign an agreement with the actual person who they're sponsoring as well. So this might seem a little bit strange to some of you, where they have to essentially sign a contract with their parents, but it's what the IRCC asks for in this as a mandatory requirement, so you have to do it. And the LICO. So for parents and grandparents, the LICO is a little bit different. It's actually LICO plus 30%. And we'll take a look at this in detail in a little bit as well. Okay, so you have a few pretty big pieces of the puzzle over here. One of those has to do with this undertaking. Just as we saw in the previous slide, a person needs to sign that undertaking in order to be eligible to sponsor his or her parents or grandparents. This is a huge, well, it's not that big actually, but it's a tricky area that can come up in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So let's take a look at this in detail. Okay, so basically, the undertaking is a promise to provide financial support and basic requirements for the family members being sponsored. The big reason for this, of course, is because the government doesn't want people to, or I guess maybe senior citizens, to come to Canada to go on welfare right away. And this undertaking really ensures that this doesn't happen. The person sponsoring his or her parents or grandparents has to sign this undertaking with the IRCC. However, if the person is based in Quebec, it's slightly different. So that person would sign that undertaking with the Midi. Now, when they talk about those basic requirements, they're talking about basically things that you need to live. Food, clothes, utility, personal requirements like toothpaste and that kind of thing. Shelter, of course. And the big important one is healthcare, not covered by public health. So as you know, well, all of you are Canadian citizens or permanent residents if you're going to join the ICCRC. You know that every time you go to the dentist, you have to pay. Or if you go to the optometrist, you have to pay. So what they're saying, of course, is that if a person sponsors his or her parents or grandparents, and they come to Canada, if they have to go to the dentist, the person who sponsored them will pay for this, of course. Now here is a pretty exciting part about this program, and that is that the undertaking is for 20 years. Now that is a huge, gigantic amount of time. And of course, this is only for parents and grandparents. When a person sponsors a child or a spouse or another family member, for example, in the last resort family class, or some people call it the lonely family member, those undertaking times are different, but for parents it's a very, very, very long time. Alright, so the time begins when that person lands in Canada. So that's of course when the PR activates as well. Now here is a big one and a really important element to understand. This undertaking is extremely serious. So it's unconditional promise of support. If a person loses all his money, maybe he gets fired from his job, or his house burns down or something like that, he is still bound to that undertaking. If the parents, for example, or grandparents get citizenship, same thing. The person who sponsors them is still bound to complete that undertaking. Let's say it's a co-sponsor and they get divorced or separated, or the relationship breaks down. They still have to continue that undertaking no matter what, even if they move to another province or anything like that. So you can see that this is a really serious undertaking to take, and there isn't anything really that stops this. Now, I'm going to bring up a point here just because a lot of people ask about this during the seminars. And that is whether or not a person who sponsored, in this case, a parent or grandparent, has to wait 20 years to sponsor someone else. The answer is that, of course, a person can sponsor as many people as he wants, really, as long as he meets those requirements. Let's say, for example, you have a scenario in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam where a person sponsored his parents and then wants to sponsor a spouse 5 years later. That's not an issue at all. Let's take a look at an example over here, for example. So the people at 2, 3, and 4, they're Canadian. Everyone's over 18. We'll assume that they meet the other requirements as well. And let's say that the gentleman at number 3 wants to sponsor his parents to become Canadian. Now his spouse would maybe co-sign with him for this, and then they would become Canadian. So let's pretend that he sponsored his parents in 2014. Now that undertaking is going to end in 2034. But let's pretend a couple years later he wants to sponsor his grandmother. And his wife, again, co-signs with him. That's not a problem as well. So they could sponsor the grandmother in, just for an example over here, 2016. And that 20-year undertaking would end in 2036. Now, another piece of the puzzle we have to completely master has to do with the agreement. Remember that a person sponsoring his or her parents or grandparents has to sign an agreement with the person being sponsored as well. And this is just to make sure that everything is absolutely clear. Now, not really for the person sponsoring his parents. Some people might think it's a bit strange, actually, that a person has to sign a contract, basically, with his or her parents or grandparents. But it's just for the IRCC, so that everybody is 100% clear about their responsibilities. So remember that the person who is sponsoring his or her parents or grandparents needs to first have that undertaking, which is basically a contract with the IRCC detailing what type of support he's going to provide to his or her parents or grandparents. Remember as well that this person also has to sign an agreement with his or her parents or grandparents detailing pretty much the same information. If you want to take a look at the sponsorship agreement and the undertaking, you can take a look at IM 1344, and the link, of course, is at the bottom here for you. Something really important to note with regard to general procedures about the family class is that if a person wants to withdraw his application for his or her parents or grandparents, all of this has to be done before permanent residency is issued. Now here is one of the final pieces of the puzzle for you with regard to this program, and that is the LICO. So this plays a role in family class in general, but specifically with parents and grandparents. Basically, it's the amount of money that a person has to prove that he makes in order to support all of these people coming to Canada. And then the not so basic part is over here. So with parents and grandparents, it's a little bit different than sponsoring someone else, in that a person has to prove his or her income for the 3 previous years. And now this has to be proven through his taxes, basically, so his notice of assessment from the CRA. With parents and grandparents, it is slightly more difficult than simply meeting the LICO. They actually have to meet the LICO plus 30%. So if the LICO, for example, right now, if the LICO is at 37,234 for 3 people, if he's sponsoring his parents, let's say it's a single person sponsoring both of his parents, he actually has to prove, for this year anyways, $48,404. And of course, Quebec is slightly different in this regard. All of those details, by the way, are in your test date data book. The really great part about having a cosigner is that both of those incomes are added. Now, if you're looking at your LICO chart in your test date data book, you could see it's a lot of money. But by having the 2 incomes, then it makes it probably a little bit easier to meet this requirement. And I'll give you a little piece of advice for when you start working as an RCIC. The LICO with parents and grandparents is incredibly important to prove. Okay, and it's not at any time in the past, so if a person made a certain amount of money for 3 years, 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, that doesn't really matter. It has to be, he has to still make that same amount of money all the way up until the day that they become permanent residents. Okay, and pretty much everything is included, so any income that the person gains is included. If a person receives child support, maybe they have some stocks that pay dividends, if they have some pension money from some previous employment, anything like that is always included in the LICO. Obviously, social assistance is not included, and a person would most likely not be eligible to sponsor his or her parents anyways if he's receiving social assistance. And just in terms of mathematics over here, or data that you might encounter in the exam, in calculating the family size for a LICO, the person would have to think of the number of family members that he or she has, even if they're living with him or not. Maybe they have a daughter or son who's a student at university and lives away from home for 8 months of the year. That person would still have to be included. Okay, the person being sponsored as well, and any accompanying family members of that person. All right, and anybody that the person sponsored before. So we talked about an example of somebody who sponsored his parents, and then maybe 5 years later wants to sponsor a spouse. So that would be 4 people because he still has his undertaking with his parents. Okay, this goes for cosigners as well, of course. Okay, and when they say not in effect, that is if the person is planning to sponsor a spouse or something like that in the future. So if we look at the example that we saw before with the family who sponsored their parents, we could see that we had the couple who were number 2 and 3 and their baby. Now, the wife and husband sponsored his parents. So the wife was the co-sponsor, and he sponsored his parents, who are number 5 and 6. Now, before the parents were sponsored, they were 3 family members. They were number 1, 2, and 3. He sponsored his parents in 2014, so he would have had to prove LICO for 5 family members. Now, they took the next steps and sponsored the grandmother later on in 2016. Again, the wife was the co-signer on that. So if he's only sponsoring the grandmother, I know we saw before the full picture over here. Maybe the grandfather passed away or something, so he's only sponsoring the grandmother. They would have to prove the LICO for 6 family members. If the grandfather was going to be an accompanying family member of the grandmother, that they would have to prove 7 people. Now, this is one of the trickiest parts of the exam, and that has to do, of course, with really specific tiny little numbers like this. That's exactly why you have your test day data book. Currently, the numbers for 2016 are, as you can see over here. In general, this number goes up about $500 every year. So the question, maybe as a scenario in your exam, you have something along the lines of a person who makes more than $70,000 a year, and he's single. Can he sponsor his parents? Okay, and the answer, of course, would be yes, because you'd look at $70,000 a year, compare it with $48,404, and that would help simplify the answer for you. You're not really likely to have a question where they would say that a person makes $48,403 and wants to sponsor his parents. That's a little bit too concise. Okay, this number goes up every year by about $500 per year, and every year you could just take a look at the link below. This is all linked for you below the video, just to make sure that you're updated on this. Or if you're watching this video in 2017. All right, so just to help us see this as a whole, again, because we looked at all those little tiny details, when we take a look at the sponsor responsibilities as a whole, we could see that, as we saw in the first few minutes of this video, the person has to be 18 or over, a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and live in Canada. They have to be sponsoring a parent or grandparent. They can have a co-signer. Remember, the co-signer's responsibility is gigantic, and it's almost the exact same thing as being the sponsor himself or herself. Remember that undertaking has to be signed between the sponsor and co-sponsor, if there is one, and the IRCC. They also have to sign an agreement with the person being sponsored, and you have those LICO requirements. Now we have the other side of this, and that is sponsor restrictions. Now this is pretty common across the whole family program, so we'll take a look at this in depth. We're going to see it again when we look at spousal sponsorship, other family sponsorship, and children But basically, someone can't sponsor a family member if they owe money, in this case. So if a person didn't provide financial support on someone that they sponsored in the past, then they wouldn't be able to sponsor someone new until they pay back that money. All of these points here are basically people who defaulted on payments. And it doesn't have to just be an immigration payment or a contract that was made to the IRCC or to someone that a person sponsored. Could be child support or alimony. If a person is receiving government financial assistance, then they would not be able to sponsor a family member. The only exception in this case is disability. And this is, of course, for parents and grandparents. So people who want to sponsor parents and grandparents, if they're receiving government assistance for a reason other than disability, they will not be able to sponsor their parent or grandparent. Okay, if they defaulted or missed some payments on an immigration loan and declared bankruptcy. Of course, the way for a person to be able to sponsor someone, again in the future, is to repay this money. Okay, there are more restrictions. So there's the financial ones that we saw before. Okay, and if a person committed a violent criminal offense or a sexual offense, then they can't sponsor a family member. Okay, and they say if it was against a family member, but a family member in this context is a little bit different than we usually think of in immigration. Usually in immigration, you think of who you can sponsor and who you can't sponsor. So usually people think of parents, nephew, niece, maybe half brother, half sister, and that kind of thing. But with this restriction with regard to violence and sexual offenses, it can be pretty much any family member, no matter how far removed. So it could be, for example, the example over here is a second cousin. And this is not only for the person who wants to sponsor his or her parents or grandparents. This is also if he or she committed or was convicted of a sexual or violent crime against the family of someone he was dating before, or a previous spouse, or anything like that. So pretty much anybody, nearly anybody related in some way, if the sponsor committed a violent or sexual crime against that person, even if he was convicted or not, then he or she would not be able to sponsor his or her parents. Okay, and one of the other ones that's a little bit more obvious is if a person's in prison or has a removal order against him. And we just took a look at LICO. If a person doesn't meet the LICO or hasn't met the LICO for the past 3 years, then he or she would not be able to sponsor his or her parents. All right, a very, very, very big thank you. I'm really happy for you. You finished another piece of the puzzle that you needed to accomplish in order to take a few steps to become closer to passing the ICCRC Full Skills Exam. I know how busy you are, but I really appreciate your time. And stay tuned because we have 3 sample questions for you.